Hi, I'm illustrator Emma Thrussell, and in this video I'm going to show you how to paint skin tones in watercolor. To demonstrate this, I have got these pre-painted witch characters and I've left out their skin tones, which I'm going to be filling in for you today. So to start, I'm going to mix the skin tone colors with my watercolor palette. To do that, I just get a lot of water on my brush, and I'm going to start with the lightest skin tone over here. And I like to get a lot of water onto my pan so that I can get as much pigment out as possible, so that I don't have to keep reapplying as I go along. So I'm going to mix the skin tones here, and for the lightest skin tone, since we're going to be doing 3 different skin tones in this, I'm going to mix this nice light yellow colour with this quite bright pink, but as I mix it together it's going to lighten, and when I add more water later, when I paint the skin, it's going to look a bit lighter than this as well. For the medium skin tone, I'm going to use the same colours, a bit of pink, a little bit of yellow, mix those together, but instead of leaving it as is, I want it a little bit warmer and a bit darker. So I'm going to take this ochre burnt umber colour and add that in, a little bit more yellow, and mix that in just to warm it up a little bit. And for the darkest skin colour, I'm going to go in with that burnt ochre colour, and then go in with a dark, cool brown colour just to mix that together. So I still want it warm, but just a little bit darker than the last. And I always darken this up a little bit later when I layer on the watercolour as I go along. So for the next step, I'm going to go over the skin tones with the first layer, which is a light wash. So to do that, I'm going to start with the lightest skin tone and add a lot of water. You really want the pigment to be really light and not too heavy, as I want it to be buildable. So I'm going to just layer that on top of here. And I'm going to keep in mind, because I want it watery, I want to add a gradient to this, and I go into that in a little bit more detail in my course. Now that I've done a light wash for this, I'm going to go in and just add a little bit more of that colour, the same colour that I used for this base, and just dab it on the ends here. And this creates a nice soft gradient, so that once the water dries, it's going to create a nice ombre gradient effect across the face. So I'm going to leave that to dry, and while I do that, I'm going to go on to the next skin tone and do the same thing with a light wash. So like before this paint dries, I'm going to use the same colour of skin tone that I've used for this particular character, so that it adds more pigment on one side of this wash. You can see it blooming there. And this is the exact same colour, but because there's less water, it gives the impression that it's a bit darker, and the layer does that to it too. I'm going to do the ear as well. So once again, I'm going to wait for this skin tone to finish and go to the last darker skin tone on the right hand side. So when doing skin tones, it's nice to have a nice even brush stroke, but if you have a lot of water on your brush, you don't have to worry too much about how you are applying it, as long as you are even and consistent. So sweeping brush strokes are fine. Just make sure that you don't have too little water on the brush, otherwise it might get a bit streaky. And to get the most control out of your watercolors, that water will really help you when you push it across the page. So there is our wash for the dark skin tone, and I'm going to go in just like the last two with the same color with a little bit less water, and just dab that over here, because I think this will be nice to have some shadow there. Doing shadows onto skin tone really does make it look a bit more realistic. Having a sense of where a light is shining on someone's face can really bring something alive. So I think it's pretty important to add a little bit of an element to that in your watercolor painting. And now you have to let that completely dry. As it's a wash, it's quite watery, so before you start layering watercolor on top of it, you want to wait for it to completely dry first. So now that has completely dried, I'm going to go in with some warmer tones on some of the facial features. So for this, I'm going to use a slightly more precise brush. So it's about half the size of the previous brush, and that'll just give me a little bit more precision when doing these facial features. To do this, I want slightly warmer versions of the tones that I've already used, and I want to go into elements like the ears, the nose and the neck, just to define them a little bit more and bring them off the page. And it was really important for this last element to dry before putting these layers on, otherwise the watercolor would bloom and bleed into the rest of the paint. So what I want to do is I'm going to start with the lightest skin tone first, and I want to add a little bit more pink to it because I want it to almost be like a blush, and add a bit more water just to lighten that color more. You can of course make it darker than this, but once again you can always build on something and make it darker rather than take it away. So I'm going to go in with the ears here, and I just want to brush on the very tips, and then I'm going to take the water and the paint off my brush, and I'm now going to just drag that paint across to add a very controlled gradient. So unlike the wet on wet method, which I was doing previously with the light wash, this is a more controlled way to add a gradient to a piece. And I'm now going to go into the nose, and this is going to be more of a flat color. I'm just layering straight on top, no gradients, and this is really good to just build up that value color, which means I am making it darker than it was before. And while I'm here, I'm going to also do the neck area. I'm going to do the same thing that I did to the ears, but instead of mimicking that flushing, I'm instead going to be mimicking that shadow that will be coming from the left to the right, to make the neck look a little bit more rounded rather than flat. Take the paint off the brush and push it along. So I'm now going to go in and do the same thing with the medium skin tone. And I'm also going to make this slightly warmer than the original tone. Just add a little bit more orange to that. Now I have lightly drawn in the details with a regular pencil, just so I can see the guidelines of where I want to put my work. And when you do this, you want to create as light of a pencil line as possible, so that you can see it for your own painting, but that it doesn't get shown at the end of your image once you've finished. And there we go. So those are the warmer tones that I've added to this particular piece. Now I need to wait for that layer to dry before I go on to my next step. So now that that is all dry, we're ready for the fourth and final step, which is to add some cooler tones for a more defined shadow. Now, with warmer tones, especially with skin tones, I like to add a contrasting color to make them pop, especially with a painting like this where I want it to look almost sunny or joyful. I like to add almost like a blue or a rich purple color for my shadows. So I'm going to still use the same brush as I did before, as I want a little bit more precision, and I'm just going to mix a very light blue color. So I'm just going to add quite a bright blue, but I'm going to add a lot of water because I don't want it to be overpowering in the piece, and also add a little bit of this purple color. This is a kind of shadow color that you would see on a sunny day. So if you look at paintings that are bright sunshine, and if you look into the shadows, you can see they're actually blue or purple rather than the tone of either the floor or whatever is being cast. So now that we've got that blue, I'm going to add a lot of water again because I want it to be as pale and transparent as I can. And I'm going to just mimic where the shadows might lay. So on the ear, the top part of the ear would get a shadow from the hat. I'm just going to layer that on top here. And you can see how the transparent blue is mixing with the skin tone underneath to make a nice natural looking shadow. And there will be another shadow underneath this brim of the hat. But also where this hairline would go, I want to create a shadow down here. So while this is still wet, I'm going to drag this down here and be very light with this because we don't want to accidentally wet the under layer and mix the two tones together. So even when you are adding a completely different color to another layer underneath, it will normally, if it's light enough, not affect the painting underneath. If you do add too much water, it may start to mix, or if you start to brush vigorously onto the underlayer, then it might start to come away. So you just want to be nice and gentle and make sure the layer is nice and light. And because this skin tone is a little bit darker at the end here, I'm going to add a bit more pigment just so we can see that nice blue shadow on this skin tone as well. Not too much more, but just a little bit more. So add a little bit more of the paint and slightly less water. So I'm just adding that cast shadow here where you can see the hairlines just brushing the face. And I have just added that darker pigment so you can see it a bit better on the darker skin tone. And up towards the ear, since once again there'll be more shadow cast down from the hair and the hat. And I want to finally put one just under the chin here and let that dry. So those are all the steps done. So now we are finished with painting these skin tones. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please subscribe to this channel. And if you'd like to find out more about me and my process, check out my online course at Domestika. You'll find the link in the description below.